Okay, so our next video for this unit is about antisocial relations. And remember, when we talk about antisocial, we're not necessarily talking in terms of like the common idea of antisocial, like not wanting to be around people, right? Antisocial are the opposite of good social relations, right? These are negative social relations. Like these are bad things is what we want to talk about, okay? So the first one that we're going to talk about is prejudice. Um, Simply prejudgment. Prejudice is us having an unjustifiable, usually negative attitude towards a group and its members. Often it's of people who are of different cultural, ethnic, or gender groups. But prejudice can be for anything. It does not have to be based on those cultural, ethnic, or gender groups. You can have prejudice towards freshmen in the school. You can have prejudice towards another school, right? So all of those are um, types of prejudice. And there's three different components of prejudice. The first are the beliefs that you hold about that group. And those are the stereotypes. The next are the emotions that you feel towards that group. Oftentimes, because prejudice is negative, it'll be hostility, jealousy, or envy, or fear. And then finally, there's a predisposition to act. If we hold this prejudice, this attitude towards another group of people, we have a predisposition to discriminate against those people, to treat them differently than our own group. Those are the three components of prejudice. Um, so prejudice can work at the conscious level. However, most of the time, prejudice is actually at the unconscious level. Therefore, it's more like this knee-jerk response, this kind of thing that happens without us really knowing, in the opinion of most psychologists and sociologists. So the question is, does that make it more or less excusable? That this isn't really something people are aware that they're doing, they're just doing it. In my opinion, it probably makes it less excusable, right? Like, isn't this exactly what we have to change? That it is so ingrained into our bodies and to our society that it's just automatic. And so while prejudice can be conscious, right? Like your prejudice towards freshmen, like you actually have to like work at that, right? You have to work at developing this idea of not liking the freshmen, but your prejudice towards another group of people might not be. So what causes prejudice? Well, there's a few different things that can cause it. First, social inequities. People who have things, people who don't have things. That right there can cause prejudice. Um, Social divisions and identities, so different colors of skin, different colors of hair, males versus females, the police officers versus criminals, all of those things can create prejudice. Emotional scapegoating, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and then thought patterns, our cognitions, how we think about things. So like the patterns of thought, where we automatically tie one's behavior to their skin color, thought patterns are simply habits. Okay, these are habits that we automatically have that we don't really have to think about. And these are the ones that we actively have to break. We intentionally have to go through and change the way that we think about other people so that this prejudice doesn't continue. So, social identities. We have in and out groups, right? The in group, badgers, yay, are people who share a common identity with us. Those are the people in our in group, right? Like think of it as your inner circle. The out group are those perceived as different from us, from ones, they're the out group. They're the people we don't want to associate with. Ohio State. In-group bias is the tendency to favor our group over your in-group rather than your out-group. You're going to show favoritism to people who are within your common identity. So college rivalries are kind of a simple example of this, right? Like we show favoritism towards Badger fans, and we're going to show some hatred or some negative feelings towards Ohio State fans. That's the idea of in-groups and out-groups. But they do get more complex than this when we're involving people's skin tone, their gender, or their role in society. A really good example of this is Jane Elliott's blue eye versus brown eye simulation that she does. There's a documentary on it that we're going to talk about, or that we're going to watch. And it is about a third grade classroom, and she decides to discriminate against um, some of these children based on their eye color. And it was right after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and she's trying to teach these kids about acceptance. And it's a really cool simulation. It is not an experiment, so we can't use it on the IB assessment as an experiment. It's a simulation. So she's simulating discrimination. But we'll watch that video in class. Okay, scapegoat theory. The scapegoat theory is when prejudice becomes an outlet for anger by providing someone to blame. This happens quite a bit throughout history. For example, the Japanese internment after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Americans were our scapegoats, right? Like, we blamed them for the attack on Pearl Harbor. The blaming of Jews in Nazi Germany. Lashing out against innocent Arab Americans after 9/11, right? Like, all of these are part of that scapegoat theory. Blaming one person, even though they might not really be the one responsible. So let's look at some cognitive roots of prejudice. Our brains love shortcuts. They want to work as little as possible. Our brains are kind of like teenagers, right? Like, work smarter, not harder. They like to group things into categories. So oftentimes we categorize people into groups based on things that are really easy for us to identify. The way we look, the way people act, the way people talk, all of those are really easily identifiable. And so we use that easily identifiable trait to group people, and then we build stereotypes around that group. And those stereotypes sometimes are based in reality. Usually they start with an experience of one person, and then they're generalized to the entire population of that group. So there's really not a whole lot of basis of the stereotypes. It becomes this big generalization. Another example of cognitive roots of prejudice are that we tend to believe that the world is fair or just, and therefore people get what they deserve, right? This is that just world phenomenon. You're going to be rewarded for positive behavior and punished for negative behavior. And so if you had something bad happen to you, you believe that you've done something to deserve it, or vice versa. The danger of this phenomenon is that it results in victim blaming, which then can cause additional prejudice. Okay, so we assume, oh, well, the Jews are being incarcerated into these camps. Well, they must have done something wrong to deserve it. That's the just world phenomenon. So how do we reduce prejudice? There's a couple of different hypotheses about this. The first, contact hypothesis. This is the idea that our prejudice will reduce if you are merely around other people. If you spend more time in that group that you hold prejudice against, then your attitudes are likely to change. But is this enough? Not really. Research shows that we need more. Part of the solution must be an intentional educational thought of changing the way that you think and behave and address those people. So we need to intentionally change our cognitions and our perceptions of the people that we are spending time around. Okay, so let's move on now to aggression, another antisocial behavior. Aggression is a range of behaviors that can result in both physical and psychological harm to yourself, others, or objects in the environment. This type of behavior centers on harming another person, either physically or mentally. Okay, so let's look at the reasons for aggression. We're going to look at both nature and nurture. The biological influences, well, we know that there's a genetic influence because some animals can be bred to have higher rates of aggression, either for sport or for research. Also, twin studies show that aggression might be genetic, and in men, aggression could potentially be linked to the Y chromosome that only men have. We also know that there are neural influences. Centers in the brain like our amygdala and other parts of our limbic system and the frontal lobe are specifically involved in our aggression. So could there be a malfunction in that part of the brain for people who are more or less aggressive? And then biochemical influences. We know that the hormone testosterone plays a role in aggression because animals who have diminished amounts of testosterone because they've been castrated become docile. And if they get injected with testosterone, their aggression increases. We also know that if there is an increased exposure during the prenatal period to testosterone, there are increased aggression in female hyenas. So there have been some studies to show that testosterone is one of the leading causes for aggression in animals. We also know that there are social and learning parts of aggression too, right? When aggression leads to the outcome that you want, like when a toddler throws a tantrum and hits you and they get what they want, they're going to learn that they should do that more often to get what they want, right? Happens more often in individualist cultures than collectivist cultures, but it does happen. Also, the cultural undertones of violence. If a culture accepts violence or aggression as the way of life, then people are more likely to do that. Now let's look at the reasons and places that people are aggressive. Well, the first is the frustration aggression principle. I think we can all agree with this one. When you are frustrated, you become aggressive. I know I do. If I'm really frustrated, I take out my anger by like yelling at my husband, right? However, most research shows that this isn't enough. It's too simplistic to say why we're aggressive. This can't be the only reason that leads to aggression. However, we do know that the direct cause of most kinds of aggression comes from negative emotions. Another reason why people are aggressive, the excitation transfer. This is the idea that if your body is aroused from one experience, it can carry over to another experience. The idea is that like if you just finished this really aggressive HIIT workout and you get home and your sister took something from your room and now you're really angry at her, you're more likely to respond aggressively because you're already aroused. Your body is already geared up to be aggressive. Okay. So the important thing here with this theory, though, is that you have to transfer that aggression. The independent situation, that sister taking your thing from your room, that is what triggers your aggression. The experience before that is just getting you aroused. So whether that be a workout or maybe you're really anxious, that's what's going to trigger the aroused state. Then the situation after that is what causes you to be angry. Okay, so what impacts our aggression? Well, aversive events in people. People who are miserable make other people miserable, right? So if you're around people that are sad or mad or angry, you're more likely to be sad or mad or angry. Stressful environments like high temperatures, air pollution, and noise, all of those increase our aggressive tendencies. I know when I get into really loud and overstimulating places like a restaurant on a fish fry in Lent, I tend to get aggressive. I lash out. I don't want to be there. I shut down because it's a stressful environment. So aggression is one antisocial behavior that we talked about in this slide, and then prejudice. So those are antisocial relations that are impacted by people around us.